It was the very first Halloween that I was able to trick-or-treat all by myself. I was incredibly excited. The days leading up to it, I couldn't help but have an enormous grin plastered on my face every waking minute. It wasn't that I disliked having my parents around constantly. It was that they were simply too slow. That, and I disliked having my parents around constantly. This whole situation came about after I overheard my mother talking with my father at the beginning of the month. They were trying to determine who'd be the unlucky soul that would have to traverse the streets with me. Ultimately, it came down to my father since my mother actually had to work on Halloween. A sly smirk stretched on her face when she told him. I could tell my father was semi-distraught over the results, and after my mother had left the room, I told my dad that I was almost too grown up to go trick-or-treating anyway, that I could just go by myself. At first, he rejected the idea. He told me that, regardless of age, it was simply too dangerous on that night for anyone to be wandering the streets alone, to which I began my clever, childish reasoning, stating things such as, I can walk with some of my friends from school, or I will only stick to the immediate neighborhood, etc. He yawned and gave me the age-old father response of, we'll see. A week had passed, and while I was out costume shopping with my father, I brought it up again. I reminded him that someone should stay home to hand out candy. He brushed me off as he tried on oversized clown glasses and a large bow tie before saying, "Welp, I'm ready for work." The sigh that emanated from me filled the entire Halloween store. It was beginning to look like I was going to be stuck with my parents again for Halloween. I apathetically picked up a faceless school costume and we checked out. On the drive home, my father looked at me, those huge glasses still on his face. As I fiddled with the packaging to my costume, he said it. "Fine, you can go trick-or-treating, but only on 2 conditions." My mood immediately perked up, and the grin I had been wearing for days began to emerge. He said, "Number 1, you will get a 2-block area. That's it, not a step farther. And number 2, you must be home before 10 p.m. And like a robot, he finished, "Failure to comply will result in grounding until Christmas." I laughed. I was overjoyed. I spent the rest of the drive home thanking him and promising not to break the rules. After that car ride, I felt like I was king of the world. During school, I sort of bragged to my friends that I was mature enough to trick-or-treat on my own, that I'd be getting much more candy than the other kids who would have tired parents with them. I could see a mix of jealousy and admiration amongst the circle of kids around me. The night before Halloween, I was trying on my costume and checking my inventory for the following night. My costume, check. 1 large pillowcase, black, check. A LED flashlight, check. Everything was ready for the following night. I was so excited I could barely sleep. I found myself lying there thinking about all the different candies I'd receive. I'd be eating like a king until Christmas at least. The night was finally here. Halloween. Immediately after school, I rushed home and threw on my costume. It was still somewhat early in the evening, so I had to sit and wait by the door for an hour or so, while my dad thrillered his way through the house with those damn glasses on. After sitting there for what felt like eons, my dad finally stopped in mid-dance and looked at his watch. Looking to me, he asked if I remembered the rules, to which I nodded. Then he said, "Have fun." Upon hearing those words, I shot out of the door like a bat out of hell. The day was still early, so not too many kids were outside already. I saw 1 or 2 walking around at this time, and a few parents with toddlers walking about. It wasn't until around 6 p.m. that the horde had descended upon my neighborhood. Costumed children of every shape and size were knocking on doors in full force. I had already been out for about an hour beforehand, so I had pretty much hit everything on my block. At that point, I started to venture out a bit further, beginning my trek towards the other houses. The sun had finally started to lose its grip on the sky, and the streetlights began to illuminate. It was around 9 p.m. when I had finished the entire area. I had so much candy that my shoulder was starting to go numb from hauling the massive pillowcase. I was starting to head back towards my house when something caught my eye. It was another street with houses fully illuminated, while the houses on the street I had just walked was starting to go dark. Greed, coupled with my clever childish reasoning, led me to think that it'd be such a shame to let all that candy go to waste. So I once again began my walk. With each house I knocked on, more candy filled my bag. One house even dumped the rest of their candy bowl in my bag just to get rid of it. It wasn't long before I reached the last house. Upon knocking on the door, an older woman dressed as a witch opened it with a smile. She handed me some more candy, and right before I left, I asked her what time it was. She told me 9:45 p.m. I nodded repeatedly and thanked her. Panic slowly began to set in my mind as I realized there was no way I'd make it back by 10 p.m. I tried calculating the speed that I would need to walk to make it home in time. That's when I noticed how dark everything had become. It seemed that every house on the street I was on had turned off all of their lights immediately after I visited them. An icy breeze cut through my costume, and I held my candy close to provide as a makeshift shield. As I began my long walk back home, I then noticed how extremely quiet it had become. Going from children screaming trick or treat to the faint whisper of the wind was somewhat unsettling. Just as I was rounding the corner, I noticed something strange. Adjacent to the corner I was standing on, something was standing across the street, just out of reach of the streetlight. It appeared to be the outline of a person. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was some kind of decoration or prop. I picked up my pace and pressed onward. After walking for a few minutes, I heard the crack of a twig a few feet behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. Standing behind the bushes I had passed only a moment before was that same outline. 1,000 alarms rang out in my mind, all of them telling me one thing: run. I decided that once I rounded the next corner, I would take off in a full-on sprint and not stop until I was safely inside my house. As soon as I turned the corner and was out of sight from the previous street, I bolted. I took 5 steps before I froze in my tracks. At the end of the street I was facing, just barely off the sidewalk, I could see it. I could see the silhouette standing in the darkness. I quickly spun on my heels and began running the opposite direction. As I ran, I felt some of the candy I had collected tumble from my bag. I crossed over streets, weaved behind parked cars, and even climbed over a couple of fences. Eventually, my lungs gave out, and I needed to stop for a moment. I then realized, not only was something following me, I was now lost. I tried to gather my bearings, to locate a street that I had recognized. Not many were familiar. After wandering for a few moments, keeping a watchful eye on my surroundings, I ended up next to a park where my friends and I would hang out on the weekends. My mood lit up at that point, as I knew I was half a block away from my house. That was quickly washed away, however, for as I walked by the park, down the road I was heading, I could see it. This time, half of it was standing in the glow of the streetlight. I ducked behind the nearby slide and watched it. Its body was encased in black, as if it were a walking shadow, but its face was a solid white. It stood there, staring straight ahead, motionless. I was sure it had to be a mask, but at the same time, I didn't want to find out. I waited behind the slide, watching this person for a few minutes. I didn't really have a choice. It was standing directly between me and the direction I needed to go to get home. After 10 more minutes had passed by without so much as an inch of movement by the thing, I started to think it was actually just a prop this time. I slowly emerged from my hiding place behind the slide and stepped away from the park. Suddenly, I saw the creature snap its head in my direction, and as if reacting to that movement, the streetlight above burst. That sent me running as fast as I ever had before. I dashed across the street. I could feel my tired legs begin to buckle under the strain. Just as I ran past wherever the creature was, I fumbled in my pocket for my flashlight. Upon retrieving it, I whipped it as hard as I could towards the silhouette. The flashlight was small but had some decent weight to it, so I could at least hurt it a bit to slow it down or something. My feet started to feel like lead at this point, and my bag of candy bounced comically from side to side. Ragged breaths forced their way through my mask. Just as I was a few houses away from mine, I tripped. Dazed, I could taste the metallic blood that ran from my nose as I tried to scramble to my feet. Before I could fully stand up, I felt tears well in my eyes as I saw that directly in front of me, only 5 feet away, was the silhouette. As it walked towards me, I stumbled backwards and found myself silently praying. Just before it reached me, it spoke. "You're in a lot of trouble, mister." It speaking caused me to hurl my bag of candy at it as hard as I could. The shadow let out a shout, and that's when I realized that it was my father, standing in front of me. I fell to my knees, bloodied and crying. He was just about to continue scolding me when he got a bit closer and saw that I was in fact injured. His grimace turned to a smile, and he told me that everything was going to be all right now. He picked me up and began carrying me back to the house. Over his shoulder, through the blood and the tears, I could still see it. Barely in the distance, that same silhouette. We finally made it home, and while my father was still pretty mad that I disobeyed him, he was just glad to have me home safe. I got cleaned up and told him what had happened. While he didn't believe all of my story, he did believe that I was hurt and lost. So the charges were reduced to a week of being grounded. I even got to keep my candy, and since I banged my face up pretty good, I got to stay home from school the next day. So suffice it to say, I was still pretty happy. However, the next morning, just as I was getting up, I bumped into my nightstand next to my bed, and I heard something hard hit the ground. My heart seized in my chest as I bent down to see what it was. It was my flashlight. I don't know what was following me that night on Halloween, or what it wanted, but it knows where I sleep, and that terrifies me. I think it's safe to say that I won't be trick-or-treating anymore.